Welcome to the MS&Me Radio Network. The broadcast shows are for informational and entertainment purposes only. They are not designed to provide listeners with specific personal, medical, or counseling advice. Individuals with a medical issue should always consult their healthcare provider. MS&Me is not responsible for content of individual shows. The views expressed by show hosts or their guests are their own. Enjoy the show.
Hi, welcome back to Living with MS, Truth Be Told. I'm your host, Marie Herron. Another feature in our employability series. We're interviewing today Trish Robichaux. Welcome, Trish. We're so happy you're here. She is a disability inclusion coach. She works with the AODA, which is the Accessibility for Ontario's Disability Act, as a compliance consultant. She is a facilitator. She's an author. She's a motivational speaker. And her company, Changing Spaces, nurtures a culture of inclusion where all people can feel safe and work safely in a non-judgmental environment. Welcome, Trish.
The name of my company is actually Changing Paces.
Sorry, it is Changing Paces. Sorry, I said Changing Places. Thanks for clarifying that. Do you want to tell us just a little bit about yourself, Trish?
Sure. Well, what brought me to this field was I actually lost my job as a result of my health 23 years ago. Mm-hmm. And I found out really early on about the need for self-advocacy. But unfortunately, not everyone is born with a self-advocacy bone, and some people have difficulty with it. So I realized that, and together with the fact that the Lord blessed me with a really big mouth, I knew that I needed to be an advocate in this field.
And I'm sure everybody appreciates it because, as you know, you and I both have MS, and we know that there's so many misconceptions, and, we do need advocates out there. And so on behalf of all our listeners, I want to say thank you. Trish, we know the business case. I just had Steve Largy from On Disabilities on air. And he gave me the business case for hiring people with disabilities, which you and I both know. However, business cases are statistics and they're evidence-based data. What is the personal toll on people with disabilities when they are left out of the labor market?
Wow, it's so huge. I'm going to start with unemployment. Mm-hmm. The rate of unemployment for people with disabilities is twice the rate of the average person without a disability.
Right.
Often people with disabilities end up living below the poverty line.
Right.
That's just the beginning. Then there's a whole dependency piece. There's the physical dependency and the emotional dependency on other people. And obviously that's going to be the spouse, the family, friends, society even, social and financial supports that they require as a result. And this eventually leads to a slow erosion over time of self-esteem without notice, really.
Right.
And that erosion of self-esteem sabotages opportunities, self-respect, and mental health. And we all know that long-term depression can be fatal, literally. I've been coaching and teaching people with disabilities for over 20 years, and I've seen it all. Depression, self-abuse, bankruptcy, divorce, even suicide. The psychosocial impact of life with disability is hard enough. Add unemployment to that mix, and you've got a recipe for disaster.
Oh, absolutely. I totally agree. I know only too well from my own diagnosis that depression with people with MS and especially people with disabilities is paramount. As I said, I was talking to Steve Largy, and he's saying there is improvement, but not enough action. If you were an employer, what would be the 3 immediate steps that you would take to make your workplace more inclusive?
Well, Steve is right. There has been improvement, but you're right also, definitely not enough action. My first step, I would I would include a statement on all of my hiring announcements. This, quote unquote, this organization is committed to building a diverse, inclusive workplace. Applicants of all abilities are welcome. That would be an appropriate phrase for you to put on all hiring announcements, advertisements for the position. And even in terms of your company, your company organizational information, because ultimately it benefits everyone that we become inclusive. But the cool thing is, once you acknowledge and commit to building an inclusive workforce, and you make that public, you enjoy business as a result of just putting it out there that you are an inclusive workplace.
And sorry, I just wanted to say, when you see the ads that say, we are an equal opportunity employer, we, accept applications from, all kinds of, vulnerable groups. Do you think that's enough? When they say that,
I definitely wouldn't word it that way.
No, I know that, but you know what I'm talking about the way they say it.
But this is the beginning.
Yeah,
this is the beginning. The next piece that I got 3 steps for you. One is to put that, this organization is committed to building a diverse and inclusive workforce. Applicants of all abilities are welcome. All right. The second piece is eliminate the disability question that shows up on most applications.
Okay.
Replace it with an accommodations question. On many, and probably most applications, there is a question that asks, do you have a disability? There's usually yes, no, or choose not to disclose.
Yes, no, or maybe.
Yeah, exactly. Choose not to disclose.
Yeah.
I personally feel it's an unfair question. Companies get away with it on a human rights issue because that same question is being asked of everyone. Mm-hmm. But ultimately, I think that it straight off the bat puts people with disability on a defensive.
Okay, that's fair.
And it's unnecessary. In fact, I think that question should be replaced with that question should be replaced with an accommodations question.
Yeah.
So instead, for example, say, is there any accommodations you require for a job interview with our organization?
Right.
Something to that effect.
Yeah. Okay? No. Yeah.
And then finally, the third step is when training new hires, include a piece on accommodations available upon request. Because most people who, let's say they're people without disabilities, people of average health, they go through their entire work life not even thinking about what an accommodation looks like or what it would be for or how it would help you. All right. But if I learn in the training that accommodations will be accommodated upon request with the organization I'm with, mm-hmm. well, that makes me feel good. That gives me almost, a safety net.
Right.
In case I ever develop, okay? It gives me, actually drives my loyalty to the company to put that in there, right?
Right.
And then, so people with disabilities, when they're reading that, then they know that they can feel free to disclose.
Right. Okay. I know, that I worked for a long time as a job search facilitator, and I know that hiring is just part of the equation. Retention is much more challenging. Do you think employers feel that retention rate for people with disabilities would be lower? And if so, what would you suggest to the employers?
Wow. The irony of that is that job retention is actually much higher for people with disabilities than the average person.
Okay.
People with disabilities are generally more, they're grateful to be working, so they do all they can to stay where they're at.
Yeah, that would make sense.
Yeah. And then the coolest thing is not only is retention rate much higher for people with disabilities, but when people with disabilities are included in the workforce, retention rates in general go up. So overall retention increases when people with disabilities are included in the workplace.
Yeah, well, somebody has to tell my staff that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm the one with the disability, and I'm the one with the best retention. Anyway, this podcast focuses on people living with MS, but we want to open the doors to employment for all people living with disabilities. And you and I have spoken at great length about changes beyond the quotas. What are your thoughts on that?
The documented truth, and I say underline documented here, is that employers that embrace employees, customers, and vendors with disabilities, they see growth in their bottom line, a more loyal workforce, and a positive reputation. Before long, we're going to have 1 in 5 people who live with a disability in this province. And now, right this minute, 53% of families are affected by disability.
That high, eh?
53%.
Yeah. Wow.
So not planning for an inclusive business is like standing at the door of your store and refusing entry to every 5th person.
Wow, is that, when you put it in that context, Trish, it's really quite astonishing. Is there a component that you feel that's already built into an existing HR programs to address the needs of people with disabilities, persons with disabilities?
Not really.
Okay.
No, not really. For example, there's no training or support there's no training on supporting an employee through the process of disclosure. And there's no training in terms of planning, career planning, and whatnot for people with disabilities. It's a multifaceted issue, the disclosure piece, and it's charged with emotions. And that does not at all get attention and compassion it warrants in the current HR process.
Yeah, that was... Sorry.
Ultimately, the entire hiring process has to be updated to include people with disabilities, from drafting inclusive job descriptions and advertisements to training anyone in a supervisory function on how to interact with people with disabilities in the workplace.
Right. And isn't this covered, though, in existing employee assistance programming?
Again, not really. Not really, Marie. There's loads of counseling, therapy, and coaching available through EAPs, but nothing geared specifically for people with disabilities. For example, I'd like to see work-life coaching for people with disabilities and disclosure planning included in that model.
Okay, great. Trish, as you know, I've worked with policymakers for quite some time. How would you encourage a company to invest in this demographic of staffing? Well,
they just need to know, and at some point they have to accept and see, hopefully they see, that it's great for business. It's positive for the bottom line, and it's positive for company culture, which in turn positively affects the bottom line even further.
Okay, I was just, when I was speaking to Steve Largy, he had mentioned return on inclusion rather than return on investment, and I think that's what I'm hearing from you. But let's say we're talking about a big company like the banks or the insurance companies or the airlines, but what about small businesses?
Well, small businesses, just like big businesses, it requires a shift in attitude before anything can happen. But ultimately, the small businesses need to see that people like to spend their money where people with disabilities are employed. So if they can make their hiring inclusive, then make sure that your customers know that you have an inclusive workplace. Post a sign even.
Right.
Because that will drive new potential employees coming in the door, and it will also drive business.
Yeah, and to that point, I recently was speaking with my mother, and she said she'll shop at one store, one hardware store over another, because that hardware store hires people with disabilities, and she likes that. And she, she's 82 years old, and she just thinks that that's a sign of, a corporate responsibility, corporate compassion, if you will.
And she is far from alone. Many people are feeling this way.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I think it's a great initiative. Going forward, what would you like to say to employers?
I want to say we all benefit we all benefit when we nurture a culture of inclusion where everyone matters and everyone contributes.
Okay. You and I are both women living with MS. What would you like to say to other people with disabilities about their prospects for employment?
First thing I want to say is don't give up. Fight for your right to work. Pursue employers who are known to be inclusive. You can actually go to Google and type in 100 top inclusive employers in your country or your state or your province, and you should find a list. But the key things to look for to find inclusive employers, to watch for power door openings, watch for accessible washrooms within the business, look for people with disabilities within the business, within the workforce. So if I'm, let's say, working and I'm trying to decide whether or not to disclose, making these observations is part of my disclosure planning, is acknowledging the corporate culture that's already there. Okay? Focus on your passions. If you're looking for work, focus on your passions, your skills, and your talents, as opposed to your limitations.
Great.
Ultimately,
go ahead.
And ultimately, if you can't find work, think about self-employment, because we all need to feel useful.
No, good. Really well said. I asked Steve Largy this question. I'm going to ask you. Do you know, I said to Steve, we were talking about what countries are taking the lead on hiring people with disabilities. He said Australia. Have you seen any models that you really, really like, that you would like, you think it would be a prototype for any of our government level, the levels of government here?
One thing that I have noticed recently, that there's a concept out there called podcast recruiting. Have you ever heard it?
No, maybe I'll start one.
Yeah, the podcast recruiting, and it's been taken on by the city of Edmonton.
Really?
Okay? Yeah, and they took it on in a big way. I'm just identifying Edmonton, that's right, City of Edmonton. They're taking it on a big way. Instead of posting text-based job descriptions when they're hiring, they are putting together a podcast about the position, about the environment, about the company culture, the whole spectrum, in a little podcast, and that's how they're recruiting.
Oh, wow, that's wonderful.
And they have had amazing response. And I can tell you exactly why. It's because while we only use 30% of our 30% of our decisions are logic-based, 70%, this is a Gallup poll, 70% of our decisions are emotion-based.
Right.
And podcast recruiting appeals to the emotional side of us, whereas a text-based ad is just about logic.
Right, right.
It's about your qualification, whatever, right?
Okay.
Whereas this emotionally based podcast recruiting, it has a potential to reach people of all abilities and of all learning styles. Pretty exciting.
And obviously somewhere like Edmonton, rural communities as well would be tuning in. I want to thank you so much. I want to apologize that I did not say the name of your company correctly. So I'm going to give you a short period of time to tell us about your company, the correct name, and then we'll say goodbye. How's that? So you can tell us the correct name and what you do.
Okay. Trish Robichaud. at Changing Paces as in steps, P-A-C-E-S, because Changing Paces is about changing your pace. Whether I'm working with individual people, professionals with disabilities, helping them change their pace so that they can plan a life to honor and accommodate their health while they drive their career to new levels, or whether I'm working with an organization. It's a change of pace to consider all applicants of value, people of all abilities, and that the most diverse workforce. The best way to drive an organization to industry leadership is to embrace the reality that a diverse, inclusive workforce includes people of all abilities.
And how do people get a hold of you, Miss Robichaud?
And that is at changingpaces.com or by email at trish@changingpaces.com.
Okay, I want to thank you so much, Trish, for taking the time out. It was just been a pleasure to speak with you. This is Marie Herron from Truth Be Told, Living with MS. And I look forward to everybody's comments and everybody's feedback and any ideas for additional shows. We'd love to hear them. Thank you, Trish.
Thank you so much for having me on this show, Marie.
No worries. Cheers. Bye.